The Missing 54. India went to war with Pakistan on 4 occasions in the last century. After the partition of British India occurred in 1947, the Kashmir region had been an object of dispute between both countries. The Indo-Pakistani Wars of 1947, 1965, and 1971 were a product of this ongoing territorial dispute. They all ended with an Indian victory. Both countries have exchanged prisoners of war apprehended during the conflicts. But for the last 2 decades, Indian families have taken several petitions to the government asking to continue searching for 54 Indian veterans that never came home. The responses from India and Pakistan have been contradictory. Indian officers admitted in the 1990s that 15 of those 54 veterans were already reported as killed in action. The rest were labeled as missing in action, stranded in the border between both countries. And yet, the current official lists of Indian casualties of war state that all 54 veterans were still missing. Chandar Sutta Dogra, a journalist that has researched the story of the missing 54 for several years, told the BBC, quote, "It is clear that the government knew some of the missing men were actually dead. Then why did they retain their names on the list? Quite clearly, there is deliberate obfuscation, and the government owes not just the relatives of the soldiers, but the people of India to come clean." From 1983 to 2007, relatives of the missing 54 traveled to Pakistani jails to search for some of the missing men. They were denied entry to the prisons, raising suspicions that some of the Indian veterans were still alive. POWs that have made their way back to India have said that more of their comrades are still alive and imprisoned, but the Pakistani government has denied it. Although families are still hopeful, other veterans believe that the surviving men were probably eliminated by the military because they were deemed Indian spies. To this date, the fate of the missing 54 has not been explained. Mystery of the 364th. When World War II broke out, the United States was still mostly segregated. Non-white Americans were treated harshly in many parts of the country. These attitudes often even extended to African Americans in the armed forces. The climate of mistrust gave rise to an enduring mystery involving the 364th Army Infantry Unit, which was made up entirely of African American soldiers. It has been rumored that over 1,000 soldiers from the unit disappeared in 1943 after being targeted by white soldiers in what was called the Camp Van Dorn slaughter in Mississippi. No records of the incident exist, but decades later, Malcolm Laplace, the regiment's clerk, accused the government of covering up certain events at Camp Van Dorn. Laplace believed his signature was forged on documents listing some men from the 364th as AWOL. Laplace said he was forced to alter some entries by command of his regiment's leader, Colonel John F. Goodman. Still, he claimed to have never heard about any mass shootings in the camp while stationed at Camp Van Dorn. Laplace did recall during interviews that racial tensions were high at the time. The 364th had been involved in a drunken bar fight the year before while based in Phoenix and had a troubled reputation, whether rightly earned or not. In Mississippi, members of the 364th were heavily guarded by white soldiers stationed near their barracks, always aiming at them with .50 caliber machine guns mounted on top of their half-tracks. However, many soldiers who were stationed at Camp Van Dorn could only recall a single notable act of violence during the 364th's assignment there. On May 30th, 1943, Private William Walker, a black member of the unit, was shot by the Wilkinson County Sheriff. The circumstances of the incident were unclear, but the men of the 364th Army Infantry were outraged. They made their way to a supply room to pick up ammunition and rifles, and then ventured into town to avenge their comrade. Colonel Goodman managed to defuse the situation with the help of a black chaplain. The soldiers backed down and returned to the barracks, but the townspeople and the rest of the white soldiers grew fearful of a possible riot. The earliest reports of the supposed Camp Van Dorn massacre first came from Omer Carroll, the Centerville mayor at the time. According to Army reports, Carroll wrote that there were rumors of up to 50 men killed. Years later, when investigators managed to get their hands on the regimental journal of the 364th, they were surprised to discover that there was no single entry during the unit's stay at Camp Van Dorn from May to November of 1943, when they left for the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Laplace was puzzled when he found out. During an interview with Newsweek about the accident, he said, quote, "That is a mystery to me. I wrote the reports, where are they?" It is widely believed that most of the missing soldiers were sent away from the unit to avoid further trouble, and the Army is thought to have tracked down nearly all of the supposedly missing soldiers. Yet some still claim that the truth about what happened during those 6 months still remains unknown. The Pearl Harbor Prediction. Earl Hancock Ellis was a U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer who became famous for writing Operation Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. It was a prophetic study written in 1921 about a future conflict between the US and Japan. Some even claim he predicted the events of Pearl Harbor. His death under mysterious circumstances following the delivery of the report is thus regarded with suspicion. In his study, Ellis wrote about the pillars of the amphibious warfare tactics that the US Marines would eventually employ during the Pacific Theater in World War II. Military authors later hailed Ellis as a visionary who foresaw an initial Japanese attack similar to Pearl Harbor. He also described tactics that the Japanese would use by fortifying every island in the Pacific to fight US troops. Like many veterans that survived World War I, however, Ellis was an alcoholic who was constantly hospitalized for his excessive drinking. He was known as a brilliant Marine, but he struggled with his illness. In 1922, he was sent to Japan to carry out a covert spying mission to study Japanese activities in the Pacific. He traveled to several islands to gather information. When Ellis fell ill due to his drinking problems, it caught the attention of the Japanese authorities. They began following him and eventually concluded that he was an officer. On May 12, 1923, Ellis was staying in Koror when Japanese officials sent him 2 bottles of whiskey as a friendly gesture. Ellis passed away that very same day. The Japanese seized all of Ellis's documents and reports on the island. His passing put in motion a series of strange events that led many to believe he was poisoned. An agent sent to investigate the events died before he could deliver his report to U.S. authorities. Dr. Lawrence Zempsch, who had treated Ellis before, traveled to Japan to witness the body's exhumation and cremation, but had a nervous breakdown on the way back to the U.S. Although modern authors state that Ellis probably died because of his excessive drinking, military personnel still affirm that he was poisoned due to the threat he posed to Japanese operations in the Pacific. His reports were never recovered. The soldier who vanished. On the morning of August 17, 1997, Guy Haver, a 20-year-old artilleryman from the Israeli army, left his post at an artillery base located on the Golan Heights and went for a short walk. He had refused to participate in a social activity organized by his unit and was to be lightly punished for his negligence. Still, he wanted to clear his mind and began walking near the zone. He never came back. At first, the military thought he had run to his family, but he was not home. They concluded that he had either taken his own life or was taken captive by Syrians, but no trace of him was found. For months, soldiers searched for his body, rifle, or belongings, but it was all futile. The Israeli army closed the case. A year after the disappearance, Rena Haver, Guy's mother, received a strange call from a psychologist stationed near the artillery base where her son had last been seen. She told Rena that she had seen a soldier who resembled her son making his way to the Syrian border on his own. Rena contacted Israeli authorities and military officials to investigate if Guy was taken hostage by the Syrian regime, but nothing was done. Years later, in 2005, Rena Haver was contacted by Marianne Koenig, a German civilian who had traveled to Aleppo and was taken into custody by Syrian authorities. She told Rena, quote, "I met your son, missing soldier Guy Haver, during an interrogation on May 3, 2005, around 2200 at night in Damascus, Syria, with 90% certainty." Rena is still looking for her son more than 20 years later, and Israeli intelligence has not been able to provide any information into Guy's disappearance. He remains a missing soldier. Pearl Harbor ghost plane. It was December 8, 1942. 1 year and 1 day before, the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese forces, opening the Pacific theater of World War II. Pearl Harbor was on full alert to repel any Japanese attack when radars allegedly picked up a strange signal. One lone aircraft was directly approaching the base. 2 fighters were dispatched to take down the aircraft, but something bizarre happened. What the pilots saw was not a Japanese bomber, but an old American P-40 with pre-war insignias. As 2 American pilots approached the P-40, they noticed it had no landing gear attached. The cabin was entirely destroyed, and the fuselage was torn apart by hundreds of bullet holes. They were even more surprised to see that the P-40 pilot didn't appear to be alive. Seconds later, the ghostly aircraft lost altitude and crashed in a field. When rescue crews arrived, they went through the wreckage. There was no sign of the pilot, but a diary was recovered. It indicated that the plane had been stationed on Mindanao, the second largest island in the Philippines. For decades, aviators and historians have tried to figure out if the story is true. Some have speculated that the ghostly pilot was a survivor of the Pearl Harbor bombing that repaired his aircraft and decided to return. Others have suggested that it was merely a story of fiction passed on as a ghost tale. No official records of the event exist.